Back with another video, and today's video is going to be looking at Manchester City versus Everton in the English Premier League, and this video is going to be made using Keyframe. Like usual, there will be a link in the description below if you want to check it out, as well as a link to my blog where you can find more tactical content, more theory and game analysis. So be sure to check that out, like and subscribe to the channel. That's a huge help. But let's get right into it. So starting off in the build-up phase for Manchester City, building from their defensive third, their center backs were split by Ederson, creating a back three, which is pretty standard for them. And now the positioning of their fullbacks became narrow straight away. And as we move up the field, these positionings of the fullbacks will become more asymmetrical, and we will form more of a back three. But in the first phase of build-up, we have the players coming narrow to create tighter passing options for faster circulation and a faster transition if possession was lost as well. And then from here, we have Bernardo Silva playing a little bit deeper, and Phil Foden will be somewhere just ahead of João Cancelo, with Mahrez and Sterling holding the width, as well as Gabriel Jesus holding the height. So now for Everton, when they pressed, it was 4-2-3-1 formation, and as they dropped deeper, it became more of a 5-4-1, which we'll go into. So their 4-2-3-1 was often overstretched in the initial phase of build-up, so they were very passive and were more than comfortable to drop into the mid-block, and they didn't get overstretched and allow Manchester City to create numerical superiority, as we can see with Diaz being able to drive forward through the half space, where then he'd have Kyle Walker, Rodri, and Bernardo Silva to create his rondo situation in the beginning third of the field. So now we see Diaz bringing the ball forward through the half space and Everton dropping off as we said they would. And now their lines become more of a 4-4-2 or 4-2-3-1, but with a little bit more compactness. So now from here, we see straight away João Cancelo starts to move in and form the double pivot with Rodri, and their interactions between each other were a little bit different because of how Everton played, and they would actually play a little bit further apart normally, but they would also base their positioning off the situation around the ball. So just as a rule of thumb though, these players against Everton played a little bit wider and focused more on the half spaces, but in this situation, with Diaz being able to progress the ball as the free player, he then progresses the ball past Richarlison to try and draw a midfielder out. So by attracting the players in the midfield for Everton, this would then create space higher up the field in between the lines for a false nine like Gabriel Jesus or a midfielder like Bernardo Silva. So with this in mind, that makes it very advantageous for Manchester City to then be able to progress the ball via dribbling and create these options going forward. So now we take the first look at a wider back three using asymmetric fullbacks from Manchester City, with Kyle Walker now staying inverted from his usual wider position. So by inverting, he forms this wide back three, and now we see the wider double pivot. And the whole reason behind this and the logic was to stretch the front two players from Everton, because they were very man-oriented, Richarlison and Sigurdsson. So by being able to stretch them, they could either draw Everton's lines to one side or create enough space in the central corridor to then just play through directly and play a vertical pass and progress the ball forward. And with Kyle Walker and Laporte creating a back three, this also created a situation where Everton's front four players now became very horizontally positioned, and this flattened the lines to then create more space through the half space and wide area for then Manchester City to exploit. So now, taking another look, moving up the field still, we have their back three. We have now the first look at the positioning of Everton and their lines horizontally and vertically being flattened. So this is the first look for Everton in one of their holding midfielders dropping. So Everton usually had their strong side holding midfielder. He would often drop into the back line as a wide central defender, as Doucouré just did here. Doucouré is jumping now because of the threat of Phil Foden between the lines, but Everton always wanted to maintain some form of numerical superiority in their last line of defense, even if it meant creating free men between the lines. So oftentimes it would be a 5-3-2 or a 5-4-1, depending on the situation around the ball, and this would then create opportunity for Manchester City to overload the midfield, as we see them starting to do here. So as we look at it, we can't see Bernardo Silva on this side, but he's higher in the half space, mirroring Phil Foden in this situation. So their five-man midfield, their double pivot, often connected the play from the first line into more advanced areas with players like Raheem Sterling holding the width. And now another important thing is now the distance between the lines for Manchester City in possession of the ball. So oftentimes their lines between their holding midfielder and their defenders would be manipulated to either draw out the Everton front two or front Richarlison, and to create this space for their pivot, or to draw out more lines to then create space between the lines. So now, looking at a whole picture of the Manchester City build-up shape against Everton's defensive block, we have our back three extending across both half spaces. We have our double pivot, and Cancelo has more freedom to get forward. And now we have Mahrez performing a positional interchange with Bernardo Silva, which puts him in the half space with Phil Foden and Gabriel Jesus just a further forward. And this now creates our five-man midfield, and we can see on the weak side, still holding the width, is Raheem Sterling, and then on this side it would now be Bernardo Silva. So now what this meant for Everton was the back five, as we just said, Doucouré dropping deeper to control Gabriel Jesus and his movement between the lines. Yerry Mina is the free player. Michael Keane is then controlling Phil Foden, and now we have our fullback being manipulated just a bit by the movement of Mahrez. So it was a very heavy man-oriented system at times, but often we see the left midfielder for Everton, he followed Bernardo Silva all the way into the wide area, and now Iwobi, Davies, and our front two were Richarlison and Sigurdsson. So this Everton system was very flexible, and they were more comfortable with jumping into the midfield to prevent the Manchester City players from turning, rather than tracking players from front to back, if that makes sense. So now, with players between the lines, we can look at the interactions of the Manchester City players. So first, we'll look at the makeshift back five for Everton, with, again, Doucouré dropping deeper as the right central defender, as we see here. And now we have Iwobi, Davies, Sigurdsson, all operating in the midfield. And now for Manchester City, we have players between the lines like Bernardo Silva and Phil Foden on the weak side. So these players would often work together and manipulate their height and widths. So when one would check back, this would create the potential for one to play in between the lines, or as he checks deeper towards the ball, this would attract the midfielders, which then open up space in the wide area for Bernardo Silva. So they would work off each other and create win-win situations while always being covered by a strong rest defense of 3 central defenders, with Walker having a little more license to get wider because of his qualities and his physicality, and always being protected by Rodri and Cancelo. So now here we are again. We'll look at the dynamics a little bit differently from Manchester City with our back 3, our double pivot, and again the double pivot manipulating the Everton defense, moving closer to one side to then pull the Everton players away from Kyle Walker, which will put him in more space to then progress the ball, as we can see here if we just align it with Digne. So by moving the double pivot, we've effectively moved Richarlison and Sigurdsson to one side while still affecting Iwobi a little bit, creating this space for Kyle Walker to then receive the ball into, which will then be closed down by the Everton player. So when Digne goes to jump and press Walker, this will then create the space in behind for players like Rodri or Bernardo Silva coming from a higher area to then exploit and take advantage of. So here we are, the situation. We have Kyle Walker on the ball, our back 3, and now we have different options around the ball, either into the half space to our double pivot or Bernardo Silva dropping deeper, or we have our direct wide option into Mahrez to take advantage of qualitative superiority. And again, with our front 3 and double pivot controlling the 2 forwards, or our Richarlison the forward and Sigurdsson the attacking mid, with the workings of the wide center backs, this creates a flat front 4 from Everton, which makes it a bit easier for Manchester City to then break in through the half space or through the wider areas. So now, looking at the whole structure, a good picture from Everton now. We have our defensive setup. We can look at it as a back 5 again. And I call it a back 5 because of the interactions of the central 3 players and their priority to create numerical advantages and protect the space in behind from the higher attacking midfielders, while the midfielders on Everton were more concerned about denying space in between the lines and more using their cover shadow. So from here, we can see the Manchester City shape. Kyle Walker and Laporte on the weak side. So from here, we have our double pivot, Bernardo Silva, Gabriel Jesus, and Phil Foden. And one key aspect of Gabriel Jesus playing between the lines is that he essentially affects the 2 midfielders when they're in this position, the 2 holding midfielders, by dropping between them. He puts them in decisions to then they have to decide on whether they follow his run or concede space through the half spaces or further forward. So by him dropping between the double pivot, it asks more questions of them. And by Bernardo Silva playing in the half space, always threatening in behind, it gives Mahrez more time on the ball to potentially use his qualitative advantage in the 1v1 situation to take Everton players on. So one more look at it, we can see clearly the whole Manchester City shape with the double pivot in our front three, and how the Everton shape becomes very flat in their makeshift back five. And we can see their 5 defenders all on one frame of the field, so all within the width of the goal box, as well as our midfielders are overstretched, Richarlison and Sigurdsson controlling the double pivot. So oftentimes what we will notice in the match was the lack of horizontal compactness now from the Everton midfielders, which really made it easy for Manchester City to find the half spaces. Although they had players jumping from deeper areas, the space between the midfielders was often open, either if it was exploited through the double pivot or if it was exploited through players like Phil Foden or Bernardo Silva. The space was there, while height was always being created through the wingers like Sterling and Mahrez. So now looking at Manchester City's pressing trap, we can see a 4-3-3 with a bit wider wingers. So Manchester City here creating close access while maintaining a little bit more vertical compactness, but always in positions to press players, and Gabriel Jesus not overextending himself too much, but we can see the holding midfielder from Everton, he's free, just blocked by cover shadow, but always the Manchester City players always create access towards him, as well as controlling the threat from players in the higher area like Doucouré dropping deeper. And we can see the body position of Mahrez getting ready to go and press the center back to then try and force Everton more narrow in their play, which would let Manchester City win the ball back in a more advantageous position. So that's why Manchester City timed their press very particularly and didn't press every single time right away the first pass, but let the pass be played once or twice to then go and press like we have here. Again, we can still see the free player in the midfield area in the pivot position to then tempt Everton to try and play this pass, which would create a wide central pressing trap, which Gabriel Jesus could use his cover shadow to block, which would then allow him to win the ball from the goalie, while Mahrez prevents or tries to prevent any wide area passes with Bernardo Silva. So now we can just see the effects. Bernardo Silva cuts out the mid-range pass, which often the City defense often forced Everton longer, which they were set up to win, and winning the ball in the half space. He then has options to go forward and progress the ball straight away. So now our last little picture about Manchester City progressing through the central area. We have our back three. You can't see Kyle Walker, but he's right here. And now we can look at the pivot interactions and the distance they create between each other. As we mentioned earlier in the video, they create a farther distance between each other to then manipulate players like Sigurdsson and Richarlison, and we'll see the distance that's created between these two players that often allow Manchester City to take advantage of the lack of horizontal compactness from the midfielders and the deeper positioning of Doucouré, which he found himself in quite often. So now with Cancelo going into the half space, Rodri going into the half space, this separates Sigurdsson and Richarlison, which forces them to press then from out to in and forcing the ball center, which is where all Manchester City's dangerous players are, between the lines, so they can receive vertical passes with the support of the two double pivots in the half space, creating a third man movement, or the players on the ball would just be able to turn and move freely forward and run out the back four, which is the picture we see here with Gabriel Jesus able to receive a vertical pass and then run out the back four, with two players running into the half spaces towards goal, and the width being held by Mahrez on one side and Sterling on the other. So that concludes the analysis for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next game, and I'll see you then.